Okay, this is for art lovers or people just interested in markets. Did you know you can buy shares of famous artworks? Well, every day investors are increasingly getting in on the action thanks to several companies that are making it a lot easier. Masterworks, for instance, makes it possible to own fractional shares of potentially lucrative pieces of art. It has been operating since 2017, but it doesn't come cheap. The minimum initial investment is $15,000. Enter Freeport. One can browse the art from Andy Warhol's double Mickey Mouse to the famously famous Marilyn Monroe. Each piece is split into 10,000 shares. Investors are encouraged to pay what they can afford and build their own art investment. And it's big business. Overall, it's estimated that more than $620 million of art has been sold fractionally in just the past 6 years. Let's talk more about this to get a better understanding of the ownership. Colin Johnson joins us. He is the co-founder and CEO of Freeport. That's a company we just mentioned. Welcome to the program. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Sean, pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
You know, I got to say, I'm going to take a little bit of ownership for this because I read an article on this, and I went to our booker, our producer, Bianca, and I said, we have to get somebody on the program to talk about this. First, explain the state of the art market and how this works and what you think it means to people like me who could never invest and actually own Picasso or Warhol or anything like that.
Maybe one day, but let's talk about the state of the art market right now, and it's actually incredibly strong. And it's really important to think about it against the economic backdrop as well. So we've got incredibly high inflation on one hand, we have potential US debt default on the other hand, which would be absolutely catastrophic for the stock market. And fine art, on the other hand, is completely uncorrelated with the stock market, right?
Yeah.
So you've got this physical asset, which tends to retain its value in times of, economic turmoil, let's just say. And we're in one of those currently. And here are the stats to give you some examples. So last year, fine art was up 29%, according to the Knight Frank Wealth Report, over the same period that the S&P was down almost 20%. I mean, Warhol's Blue Shot Marilyn went for $195 million last year. It's absolutely incredible. So that's the kind of sort of momentum that the art market has right now. And especially, against this backdrop that we're looking at, it's particularly enticing.
Okay, tell me about fractional ownership. I guess it's just what it sounds like. And what does it give someone who makes this investment? Can they say, hey, I own a Picasso?
Yeah, so technically the way that this works, I'll make it as simple as possible. You take the piece of fine art, you give it to an LLC, and then you issue shares in that LLC that has one single asset, the piece of art. And by doing that, by having this sort of lightweight structure around the art itself, you can actually have all these different shareholders effectively owning the painting or having exposure to that painting. So when you think about fractional art investing, you can almost think about it as like Nike stock or Apple stock. But instead of the company that's building things, it's just one singular asset, the piece of art. And that means you get to get in for a much lower price.
Okay, who are the key players and where do you find this being popular?
So you mentioned one of them previously. We've got Masterworks, there's Rally Road out there, Yield Street, Artori Winston, obviously Freeport, as you just mentioned. We're kind of the cool new kids on the block, or I'd like to think so. And it's growing really quickly. Desire for fractional art is growing quickly, both here in the US, but also in Asia and the Middle East, and especially amongst young investors, and specifically young wealthy investors who know a little bit about alternative investing. They know about diversifying a portfolio, and they understand what it means to own sort of physical, tangible assets, again, in these kinds of markets.
Okay, what is the benefit to the approach? What does the investor get out of this?
Yeah, so the best way to think about it is, so fine art has outperformed the S&P 500. If you look at the art price 100 over the past 23 years, fine art has well outperformed the S&P 500 by about 40%. But those are the pieces of fine art that are worth $200,000, $500,000, $1 million, right? So if you want to get exposure to the potential upside, which has outperformed the S&P 500, historically you've needed $500,000 or $1 million to spend on a piece of art. That means, A, you have to be very, very fortunate to be in that position. B, you don't have a very diversified portfolio, right? Because you're just sitting there with your one piece of highly expensive art. And that's not the place you want to be, right? So ideally, you can access these shares that give you exposure to fine art, and you can purchase multiple different pieces and sort of create your own collection. And yes, you can totally tell your friends that you own shares that are backed by that piece of fine art.
That's pretty amazing. Talk about what you're doing, and also talk about NFT. Is there any kind of way where this intersects?
Yeah, so Freeport actually, and people should check out our offering circular on the website, I should mention that, but on Freeport, we're doing both. So we're not selling NFTs, and we are SEC qualified, but what we're doing is offering access to the shares that I mentioned previously that have been tokenized and that exist on the blockchain. NFTs are slightly different. Those are digitally provenance. They generally don't have any physical good attached to them. They're non-fungible. So that means, with a share of stock, you can trade one for the other.
Right.
With an NFT, it has its own sort of metadata and its unique characteristics that make it non-fungible. And that's where the name comes from. Now, they are attached to artwork, and there is sort of this NFT revolution that's ongoing. So on Freeport, as an example, we let people display their NFTs next to the pieces of fine art that they invest in on our platform, but they are significantly different. I will say that.
Sure.
The SEC is not a fan of NFTs, and they just come around to tokenization.
I imagine the SEC went through you guys with a pretty fine-tooth comb. Tell me about that process, and what does the investor get? Is there like a physical slip of paper or anything, or just the way the regular stock would break out? It's there because you get an email once a month.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, it was about a 9 to 12 month process with the SEC. Roughly 9 of those months were us preparing and making sure everything was legally in order. We're a US-based entity. We need to make sure that the artwork is stored, that all of the contracts are signed, that we're financially audited. All of that stuff that you would expect the SEC to do, they did in spades. But at the end of the day, we did get through and get the qualification roughly 8 weeks ago. As far as what you get as an investor, if you look at a lot of these platforms and a lot of the ones that I mentioned before, what you do get is effectively a ticker symbol for your piece of art and the number of shares that you own, and then a bunch of charts and candlesticks that show you how much money you can expect to get back over time, right? What your returns are. What we're doing a little bit differently is that we're allowing folks who invest on our platform to then display the artwork that they have purchased shares in a virtual gallery. So we're creating more of this collector's experience than any of the other players. And let me just tell you why that matters. When you look at polls right now, the number of people who invest in art just for returns is less than 10%. The number of people or the percentage of people that invest in art just for the aesthetics is about 15%. The other 75% invest in art because they like the aesthetics, they like collecting, and they expect a return at some point in the future. So it's a combination of those two things. So in our scenario, we're sort of up-leveling the experience a little bit and offering this virtual gallery where people can come and display the assets that they invest in.
Quickly, 10 seconds, tell me about your favorite work of art you have right now.
Ooh, my favorite work of art that I have right now, this might surprise you. Back here on the wall behind me, there's this guy by the last name of Morris. He goes to yard sales, he buys old pieces of art, and then he draws these robots into them with lasers coming out of their eyes. You can tell that I have a tech background, and I absolutely love that piece. I just got it within the last year.
Okay, I think my producer's now throwing lasers at me for going over the time, but thanks very much. I greatly appreciate this. Fascinating. I look forward to digging into this a bit more. Okay, from visual art to the most renowned work of Renaissance architecture, some of the most famous artists and sculptors in history worked on the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, including Michelangelo and Bernini. But the structure is now being restored by a new generation of sculptors. Giles Gibson has more from the Vatican.
Learning their craft one block of stone at a time. With the famous dome of St. Peter's Basilica looming over them, these students are learning how to look after a building at the heart of the Catholic faith. They're about to graduate from a school set up by La Fabbrica di San Pietro, or the Factory of St. Peter's, which offers 6-month courses in masonry, woodworking and other traditional crafts. Filippo Gallarini is a sculptor who's one of 20 students learning from the San Pietrini, the workers who look after St. Peter's.
From the beginning, we've been discovering new things every day, either with the San Pietrini or with our professors, art historians or conservationists. They show us a different side of St. Peter's.
But picking up a chisel here, of all places, means you've got some pretty big shoes to fill. Some of the most famous artists and sculptors in history worked on St. Peter's Basilica, including Bernini and Michelangelo. And now, hundreds of years later, these students are making their contribution to the upkeep of this extraordinary building. With many San Pietrini retiring over recent years, there was a risk their expertise could be lost forever. So part of the school's mission is to make sure their skills are passed on to the next generation.
For them, it's a unique experience because in the Fabbrica di San Pietro, for about 500 years, there's been a lot of practical knowledge handed down. So for San Pietrini of a certain age, it's a privilege for them to be able to teach what they know about St. Peter's to these enthusiastic young people. So we give and we also get something back at the same time.
With the first round of 20 students set to graduate, the school is planning to expand its classes, including more specialisms such as metalworking. The hope is to preserve a building that's watched over this city for generations, for many more centuries to come. Giles Gibson for CGTN, the Vatican.